All right, guys, part 2 of our chapter titled Miss Honey's Cottage. Yes, I am in our classroom. Have a little look. Bit quiet without you guys here, just sitting on my own, reading a bit of Matilda. So, Matilda's gone over to Miss Honey's house. Let's have a read what she sees. Matilda saw a narrow dirt path leading to a tiny red brick cottage. The cottage was so small it looked more like a doll's house than a human dwelling. The bricks it was built of were old and crumbly and very pale red. It had a grey slate roof and one small chimney, and there were 2 little windows at the front. Each window was no larger than a sheet of tabloid newspaper, and there was clearly no upstairs to the place. On either side of the path there was a wilderness of nettles and blackberry thorns and long brown grass. An enormous oak tree stood overshadowing the cottage. Its massive spreading branches seemed to be enfolding and embracing the tiny building, and perhaps hiding it as well from the rest of the world. Miss Honey, with one hand on the gate, which she had not yet opened, turned to Matilda and said, "A poet called Dylan Thomas once wrote some lines that I think of every time I walk up this path." Matilda waited, and Miss Honey, in a rather wonderful slow voice, began reciting the poem. "Never and never, my girl riding far and near, in the land of the hearthstone tales and spelled asleep. Fear or believe that the wolf in the sheep-white hood, loping and bleating roughly and blithely shall leap. My dear, out of a lair in the flock leaves, in the dew-dipped year, to eat your heart in the house in the rosy wood." There was a moment of silence, and Matilda, who had never before heard great romantic poetry spoken aloud, was profoundly moved. It's like music. Here's a little image of Miss Honey's cottage. Roald Dahl's description is incredible. "It is music," Miss Honey said. And then, as though embarrassed at having revealed such a secret part of herself, she quickly pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Matilda hung back. She was a bit frightened of this place now. It seemed so unreal and remote and fantastic, and so totally away from the earth. It was like an illustration in Grimm or Hans Andersen. It was the house where the poor woodcutter lived with Hansel and Gretel, and where Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived, and it was also the house of the 7 dwarfs and the 3 bears and all the rest of them. It was straight out of a fairy tale. "Come along, my dear," Miss Honey called back, and Matilda followed her up the path. The front door was covered with flaky green paint, and there was no keyhole. Miss Honey simply lifted the latch and pushed open the door and went in. Although she was not a tall woman, she had to stoop low to get through the doorway. Matilda went after her and found herself in what seemed to be a dark, narrow tunnel. "You can come through to the kitchen and help me make the tea," Miss Honey said, and she led the way along the tunnel into the kitchen. That is, if you could call it a kitchen. It was not much bigger than a good-sized clothes cupboard, and there was one small window in the back wall with a sink under the window, but there were no taps over the sink. Against another wall there was a shelf, presumably for preparing food, and there was a single cupboard above the shelf. On the shelf itself there stood a primus stove, a saucepan, and a half-full bottle of milk. A primus is a little camping stove that you can fill with paraffin, and you light it at the top, and then you pump it to get pressure for the flame. "You can get me some water while I light the primus," Miss Honey said. "The well is out the back. Take the bucket. Here it is. You'll find a rope in the well. Just hook the bucket on the end of the rope and lower it down, but don't fall in yourself." Matilda more bemused than ever now. took the bucket and carried it out into the back garden. The well had a little wooden roof over it and a simple winding device, and there was the rope dangling down into a dark bottomless hole. Matilda pulled up the rope and hooked the handle of the bucket onto the end of it. Then she lowered it until she heard a splash and the rope went slack. She pulled it up again, and lo and behold, there was water in the bucket. You can see Matilda at the well. "Is this enough?" she asked, carrying it in. "Just about," Miss Honey said. "I don't suppose you've ever done that before?" "Never." "It's fun. How do you get enough water for your bath?" "I don't take a bath," Miss Honey said. "I wash standing up. I get a bucket full of water and I heat it on this little stove, and I strip and wash myself all over." "Do you honestly do that?" "Of course I do. Every poor person in England used to wash that way until not so very long ago. And they didn't have a primus. They had to heat the water over the fire in the hearth." "Are you poor?" "Yes," Miss Honey said. "Very. It's a good little stove, isn't it?" The primus was roaring away with a powerful blue flame, and already the water in the saucepan was beginning to bubble. Miss Honey got a teapot from the cupboard and put some tea leaves into it. She also found half a small loaf of brown bread. She cut 2 thin slices, and then, from a plastic container, she took some margarine and spread it on the bread. Margarine, Matilda thought. She really must be poor. Miss Honey found a tray, and on it she put 2 mugs, the teapot, the half bottle of milk, and a plate with the 2 slices of bread. "I'm afraid I don't have any sugar. I never use it." "That's all right," Matilda said. In her wisdom, she seemed to be aware of the delicacy of the situation, and she was taking great care not to say anything to embarrass her companion. "Let's have a sit in the sitting room," Miss Honey said, picking up the tray and leading the way out of the kitchen and down the dark little tunnel into the room at the front. Matilda followed her, but just inside the doorway of the so-called sitting room, she stopped and stared around her in absolute amazement. The room was as small and square and bare as a prison cell. The pale daylight that entered came from a single tiny window in the front wall, but there were no curtains. The only objects in the entire room were 2 upturned wooden boxes to serve as chairs and a 3rd box between them for a table. That was all. There was no pictures on the walls, no carpet on the floor, only rough unpolished wooden planks, and there were gaps between the planks where dust and bits of grime had gathered. The ceiling was so low that with a jump, Matilda could nearly touch it with her fingertips. The walls were white, and the whiteness didn't look like paint. Matilda rubbed her palm against it, and a white powder came off onto her skin. It was whitewash, the cheap stuff that is used in cowsheds and stables and hen houses. Matilda was appalled. Was this really where her neat and trimly dressed school teacher lived? Was this all she had to come back to after a day's work? It was unbelievable. And what was the reason for it? There was something very strange going on around here, surely. Miss Honey put the tray on one of the upturned boxes. "Sit down, my dear, sit down," she said, "and we'll have a nice cup of tea. Help yourself to bread. Both slices are for you. I never eat anything when I get home. I have a good old tuck-in at the school lunch, and that keeps me going until the next morning." Matilda perched herself carefully on the upturned box, and more out of politeness than anything else, she took a slice of bread with margarine and started to eat it. At home, she would have been having buttered toast and strawberry jam, and probably a piece of sponge cake to round it off. And yet, this was somehow far more fun. There was a mystery here in the house, a great mystery. There was no doubt about that, and Matilda was longing to find out what it was. Miss Honey poured the tea and added a little milk to both cups. She appeared to be not in the least ill at ease, sitting on the upturned box in a bare room, and drinking tea out of a mug that she balanced on her knee. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking very hard about what you did with that glass. It is a great power you have been given, my child. You know that?" "Yes, Miss Honey, I do," Matilda said, chewing her bread and margarine. "So, as far as I know, nobody else in the history of the world's been able to compel an object to move without touching it, or blowing on it, or using any outside help at all." Matilda nodded, but said nothing. "The fascinating thing would be to find out the real limit of this power of yours. Oh, I know you think you can just move just about anything there is, but I have my doubts about that." "I'd love to try something really huge," Matilda said. "What about distance?" Miss Honey asked. "Would you always have to be close to the thing you were pushing?" "I simply don't know," Matilda said, "but it would be fun to find out." What a fantastic little relationship that's developing between Miss Honey and Matilda. So Matilda has this gift and Miss Honey wants to find out more about it. She's like, let's see if we can get to the bottom of it and see what we can do. The next chapter is called Miss Honey's Story, which we will read again tomorrow. All right, well done, team.